Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. What happened to Iraq's oil wealth? That is the central question of the book Pipe Dreams, The Plundering of Iraq's Oil Wealth by my guest today, Erin Banko. Erin Banko is an investigative journalist at the Star Ledger in New Jersey, where she covers the intersection of money and government. She has reported from the Middle East for years, and she puts her investigative skills to use by examining documents and cultivating sources who explain the sordid tale of corruption that is surrounding Iraq's oil wealth, particularly in the Kurdish region, which is the focus of her book. Iraq sits on the world's fifth largest oil reserves, but oil wealth has not trickled down to the Iraqi people. In this conversation and in her book, Erin explains why. Now, a quick side note, we recorded this conversation while Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, was still Secretary of State. Of course, he has been replaced, or I should say will be replaced. They've recently set a date on Mike Pompeo's nomination hearings. But just keep that in mind when you're listening to this conversation. And one last thing before we begin, a big thank you to everyone who is leaving reviews on iTunes. I so appreciate the support. If you're new to the podcast, please go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and check out our robust archives of people I've interviewed and topics we've covered. There is a lot there, and you can have some fun. All right, now here is my conversation with journalist Erin Banko. Hey folks, Northwestern University is seeking candidates for their online Master of Science in Global Health program. Learn how to make a meaningful difference in places where it's needed most. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and click on the ad to learn more, or go to sps.northwestern.edu/global.
So my book focuses on the Kurdish region of Iraq, which holds not a lot of the total amount of Iraq's oil, but it holds, some people say, about 10% of Iraq's total reserves, though that number sort of fluctuates depending on who you talk to. And that's only because the seismic studies that have been done aren't incredibly accurate. But what makes this region interesting in terms of the oil that it does have is that the oil sector itself is newer, in the sense that international oil companies came to the region in mass post 2003. There were some that were there before that. There were about 6 contracts signed before the invasion. But for the most part, the companies came after the toppling of Saddam. And that's sort of different than when you look at the oil sector in Baghdad, which is overseen by the central government, which is obviously decades and decades older than that. And so they operate separately. They have 2 different sort of oil contract models. The ways in which they interact with international oil companies are quite different. There are open, sort of transparent bidding rounds in the south of the country, and in the north, everything is sort of negotiated privately. So there's a really big difference between the two.
But we're still talking about a lot of oil globally. I mean, 5% or 10% of Iraqis' oil wealth is still a good amount of oil, considering that Iraq has a good percentage, something like 10, 12% of the world's oil reserves.
Yes, of course. Iraq as a whole, it holds a large percentage of the world's oil wealth, and is in OPEC and is a major player in OPEC. But I just wanted to make clear that my book focuses on the northern region. And that's only because that is where my companies were sending me at the time, and it's where I sort of had the best access to tell the story of the plundering of the oil wealth in that region and how it contributed to the overall plundering of the country's oil wealth. But yes, I mean, Iraq is a very significant player in terms of the world oil market, and it's at a very interesting time right now, given what's going on in the country, especially in terms of, the country just held, the Kurdish region just held its first referendum for independence, which was not upheld. And now we have this big standoff between the Kurds and the central government over oil wealth. The whole sort of tension and sort of negotiations about the budget are focused on oil. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we are right now. And the world's sort of looking at Iraq to see what happens next. They have elections coming up in the spring, but investors in particular are looking at Iraq to see if it will once again become a country ripe for investment, and steady enough for investment, or if it will, sort of falter in that way, and if its economy will continue to sort of decline.
So I remember watching the build up to the Iraq War and having Paul Wolfowitz, one of the architects of the Iraq War, who at the time was an official in the Department of Defense, arguing that the reconstruction of Iraq after the war would pay for itself from oil money. He sort of famously said it would be hard to imagine that it would cost more to rebuild the invasion than it would to mount the invasion itself, given Iraq's oil wealth. So obviously that didn't happen. And your book, I think, explains one reason. There are probably many reasons why this has happened, but corruption is a big reason here. So can you, I guess, talk a little bit about like the mechanics of corruption of the oil sector in the Kurdish region? Like, how does it work from like a granular level?
Sure. Yeah, I remember that quote that you're talking about. The idea post, invasion was that the country would rebuild itself sort of organically in the sense that it would use the wealth from its own oil and its own natural resources to invest in itself. And I think that, the Kurdish region and possibly Iraq as a whole is sort of a classic example of the resource curse, right? Where there's a significant amount of a particular kind of natural resource that should be used hypothetically to generate revenue, which is then sort of injected back into the local economy to pay civil servants, to build roads and hospitals and schools. But as you said rightly, that didn't necessarily happen in the way we all thought it would. And so one of the reasons for that, looking at the Kurdish region in particular, and the story is sort of similar in the central government, though it looks a bit different, is that there's an incredible amount of corruption, particularly in the oil sector in the Kurdish region, right? So, and the corruption really, it sort of trickles down from the top to the bottom into the local economy.